Energy stocks are up today following that attack on Saudi Arabia's oil supply. But while Canadian stocks hit a record high last week, energy as a group has been this year's worst performer. We've heard the narrative of foreign investors giving up on Canada's oil sector. Against that backdrop, Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney has made a trip south of the border to pitch American investors on Canada's energy industry. Premier Kenney currently in New York City, and he joins us from Bloomberg's world headquarters. Good morning.
Good morning.
So maybe you can give us a little more color on this trip. You're meeting with a bunch of investors. Is there any one person or firm that you want to connect with on this trip?
No, I'll be meeting with a number of private equity firms, financial institutions, hedge funds, and others, as well as financial media, to tell the story about how Alberta and Canada are the safest and most reliable source of energy on Earth, with Alberta with the third largest oil reserves, the fourth largest natural gas reserves. And I think that safety and reliability is now more important today than, people have always talked about energy security. Well, it means a whole lot more after what happened in Saudi Arabia this weekend. So we want to encourage U.S. policymakers to help us move forward with the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline that would bring on stream nearly a million barrels per day of Alberta crude moving to American refineries. We're optimistic about the Trans Mountain pipeline happening to the West Coast. There are pipeline companies engaged in increasing shipments through pipeline optimization. We think it's very likely that we'll see an increase in rail shipments as well. Frankly, the increase in prices is probably going to help with that. So we think both in the short, mid, and long term, there's a very positive story. We're also reducing the corporate tax burden by 1/3, reducing the red tape burden, speeding up regulatory approvals. We brought balance back to Alberta labor legislation. We have the youngest, best educated population, lowest taxes. I mean, there's so many reasons, not just in the energy sector, but in other sectors for companies to think about locating in Alberta.
More specifically, because you referenced the attacks over the weekend, what would you say specifically about Saudi Arabia's oil supply and its security?
Well, it's obviously always a question that's been, Saudi Arabia is surrounded by Yemen in a huge civil war, Iran, a belligerent enemy of Saudi Arabia, Iraq. This is not a friendly neighborhood. And we've always known this in geopolitics that Gulf-based oil has a security premium that's going up as we speak in markets today. There is no security premium for Alberta energy. We have the most with the safest and most reliable major source of energy on the face of the planet. And for Americans, that is a great benefit. So we want to remind our American friends here that if they don't want to pay a security premium for energy, they should be operating more and investing more in Alberta and importing Canadian energy. We can do that by getting some of these pipelines completed, including the Line 3 and replacement, and of course, Keystone XL.
Your American friends have been reminded by their own president today on Twitter about the U.S. transition to becoming a net exporter of oil and, in his words, the #1 energy producer in the world. What's your reaction to the president's comments?
Well, that's objectively true, and here's the interesting thing. While there have been a number of U.S.-based foundations funding a campaign to oppose construction of pipelines in Canada, basically a campaign to landlock Alberta energy, at the same time, there has been a doubling of oil production in the United States. And by the way, it's no secret that we've seen a lot of capital leave the Alberta energy sector. Every one of those dollars has moved into the energy sector in the United States and other jurisdictions, fueling the growth in Permian oil production and the Bakken in North Dakota, for example. So all we've seen really is the shipment of capital and jobs from the Alberta to the American energy sectors. Listen, I understand that. Good on the United States for developing its own resources. But I think it's in everybody's interest. It's in the interest of global peace and security that we should have greater global access to Canadian energy to compete with and displace unreliable OPEC energy and energy produced at lower environmental, human rights, and labor standards in OPEC dictatorships and Russia, for example.
Now, you're in New York. There are a couple of stops on this trip south of the border to get the word out. Did you consider, because you're talking a little bit about pipelines, visiting Minnesota or Michigan? Because we've reported a lot on Enbridge having their projects facing hurdles, for example, in those states.
Well, I will be passing through Michigan, and we've been in touch with the governor's office and exchanged correspondence on the litigation led by her attorney general against Line 5. We think that would be, frankly, an economic disaster for the the Great Lakes states, including Michigan, if that state government succeeds in prematurely shutting down Line 5. Enbridge is committed to building a new pipe under the lake floor that will be 100% secure. The current Line 5 pipe is 100% secure. But if they succeed in taking that off stream, it's going to massively spike gas prices in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, even Illinois. And that's one of the reasons I'll be meeting with the governor of Ohio later this week to discuss the common interest of the Great Lakes states in having access to the 500,000 barrels per day of Alberta crude that is supplied by the Enbridge Line 5.
Premier Kenney, One Energy executive Jeff Tonkin of Birchcliff told us on this very program last week that U.S. investors gave up on investing in Canada because, quote, they got their faces ripped off. If we look at our own TSX Energy Index, we've seen about $170 billion in market value wiped out in the past 5 years. Have you put any specific targets on this trip? In other words, are you looking to secure $1 million worth of new money investing in energy stocks, or the industry, $100 million, $1 billion? What would be a successful trip for you?
Well, look, this trip is just part of a bigger strategy that our new government is launching to restore investor confidence in our energy sector and to, quite frankly, stand up and fight back against those groups that have largely been funded out of the United States to landlock our energy. So I don't come to this trip with some dollar figure in mind, but I am here very early in the tenure of our new government to tell a very positive story. For example, we are headed to by far the lowest business taxes in Canada, and we will have a lower tax rate in Alberta, federal, provincial combined, than 44 of the U.S. states by 2022, speeding up approvals, reducing red tape, balance in our labor legislation, affordable property, lower taxes generally, the youngest, best educated workforce. We have an amazing story to tell. It's not just about energy, and I'm here to tell that story, and hopefully investors will respond. All
right, well, we'll see how it resonates with investors in the U.S. You clearly laid out some of the things that your government is doing. As we watch some of the, outside of today, the pressure that a lot of energy companies have been facing, we've seen some feeling more pressure to just buy back their own stock. I mean, if they believe that they've got good, sound businesses, bet on themselves. What do you think about the idea of the provincial government using its own funds to invest in Canadian energy stocks? Is that something that you would consider?
No, we're not keen on getting into the business of picking winners and losers. Ours is a market-oriented government. We're trying to create the right overall macroeconomic conditions that are favorable to new business investment that creates jobs. But there are some things that we are open to. We'll be making final decisions. For example, the idea of a new round of royalty tax credits for petrochemical diversification to take advantage of the inexpensive natural gas feedstock to upgrade into plastic and other products. So there will be some incentives that we do offer. The major incentive, though, is this 1/3 reduction in the overall tax rate. And listen, one of the things I'm going to say to investors in New York here is that energy shares in Alberta, in Canada, Canadian companies, are massively undervalued objectively. This should be seen as a buying opportunity, and that should be even clearer in light of the security premium that people have to pay to access Middle Eastern oil, given what happened last week. And by the way, the strike against the refineries in Saudi is not the end of the story. It points to a deeper problem in terms of instability and unpredictability from the OPEC countries. And so I hope investors will realize safety, stability, security in Canada is worth an awful lot.
All right, Premier Kenney, good to get your perspective. Thanks very much for stopping by today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Jason Kenney, Alberta's Premier, joining us on his trip to the U.S. to pitch investors on Canada's energy sector.